right, if we can go ahead and get a seat. Is everybody enjoying their food from Redemption Foods? Have you guys enjoyed, did you guys enjoy the breakout sessions? All right, great. Before we get started, I just had a quick announcement from Dwayne Carr, class of 2014, and I'll have him come up here.
Good afternoon. I'm from the National Black Law Journal here on campus. The journal has been here for a while now. It left us and went to Columbia, but it's back. And we're trying to basically get going again. So we're outside with information about the journal. We simply just wanted to signal to you, the academic community, that if you're ever interested in publishing in areas that intersect race and the law, there's a journal here right at UCLA with which you can publish. So if you have any further information about the journal, please, you can speak to me, you can speak to Rissam Garieb, or I think you can also speak to our faculty advisor, Professor Cheryl Harris. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. All right, here we go. You're in for a treat. I am Jyothi Nanda. I'm the co-faculty director with Cheryl Harris of the Critical Race Studies program, and I'm delighted to see all of you again today. I have the honor of introducing Maisie Chen, who is our keynote, so I will try to be very brief. I encourage you to read her bio in the program. I'm going to start with a quote from Derek Bell. It's the end. It's the last quote. It's the last two sentences in his Interest Convergence article that we've been talking about all morning. He writes, "Criticism, as we in the movement for minority rights have every reason to learn, is a synonym for neither cowardice nor capitulation. May instead bring awareness. Always the first step toward overcoming still another barrier in the struggle for racial equality." And it is with great honor, in light of that quote, that I introduce Maisie Chen as today's keynote. We've been discussing Bell's work today, today, and we will be discussing it for years to come. Yesterday, Professor Lopez spoke profoundly of how Bell began his career in litigation, fighting to end segregation in our public schools. And Bell did that because he believed in transformative justice. And so does Maisie Chen. She actualizes this theory. She truly seeks to eradicate permanent bias on a fundamental level every single day. Started with the vision, Maisie has in 12 years turned her dream into a reality by co-founding and now serving as the executive director of CADRE, Community Asset Development Redefining Education, which is an independent grassroots parents membership organization in South Los Angeles, comprised of low-income African American and Latino parents and caregivers whose children attend public schools. CADRE's mission is simple but very profound: to solidify and advance parent leadership to ensure that all children are given rightfully education regardless of where they live. CADRE has been at the forefront of pushing the conversation about the ways in which we treat our Latino and African American children here in Los Angeles. 10 years ago, as many of you know in this room, few people were talking about the school-to-prison pipeline. Few people were talking about the word push-out. And school expulsion issues within schools was really a burden borne by the families alone. CADRE came into existence during a period when parents needed them the most and have started a conversation that has grown nationally. A conversation about the ways in which we treat low-income kids in our public schools. And Maisie is the leader behind that vision. A native Californian and a child of Chinese immigrants, Maisie has spent 20 years dedicated to fighting structural racism by protecting and transforming public education in low-income neighborhoods of color. She has an incredible resume. A few highlights include securing $1 million in funding for CADRE, developing and writing Giving LA's Youth Real Voice and Real Power, a call to action for youth engagement, with policy and programmatic recommendations for organizations and public institutions across Los Angeles County to increase access for youth to meaningfully participate in decisions that actually affect them. In addition, CADRE is a founding member of the Dignity in Schools campaign, which is a national campaign that many of you may be on their listserv. And it's a national coalition seeking to end school push-out federally, and it's currently in 20 states. She actually bleeds blue and gold. She's a double Bruin with a bachelor's from UCLA and a master's in urban planning. And when I asked some of her colleagues, she doesn't know that I did this, when I asked some of her colleagues to describe her, I was really struck by the profoundness of their words. Maisie is brilliant, they said. Someone who is real, humble, and someone who believes above anything else in her core that everyone has the ability and capability to have greatness and to soar beyond what is expected of them. Located on Broadway in Manchester and South LA, many of the parents CADRE works with didn't finish high school, some didn't even finish middle school. But to Maisie, that doesn't matter. They're all in the same struggle, like we are all in the same struggle together. In the words of her colleague, Maisie is providing hope and change to communities where hope and change means so much in their daily lives. She's leading a movement that is truly dismantling structural racism, and to me she shows us how it's done, how we seek true social justice transformation, and for these reasons I'm so grateful that she's here with us today. Please, let's give a rounding applause to Maisie.
Wow, that kind of blew me away, Professor Nanda. Can you all hear me? I want to make sure I can be heard. I told Professor Nanda that I usually panel, I don't keynote. So this is a relatively new experience, but I did take on the challenge because I do think it's important to unpack some of the underpinnings of what CADRE has been able to do and some of the pearls of wisdom that we've learned along the way. So I really am honored to be here today, and many warm wishes and a good afternoon to all the wonderful human beings presently gathered and or remembered here today to celebrate the 10-year legacy of the Critical Race Studies program here at UCLA Law. And especially honored to just know that you are honoring all the groundbreakers as well that have brought this program and many programs like it into existence. I'm truly honored and humbled to be part of this celebration, to acknowledge and be in the company of instigators of relentless troublemaking, and all the more so when it's coming out of Bruin Nation. So, double Bruin, that's great. I'm going to have to use that again. So as was mentioned when Professor Nanda introduced me, I've been blessed to co-found and build a small and mighty organization called CADRE in South LA. And I specifically call this journey a blessing because it has allowed me to live out a very particular credo that has been seminal in my political evolution as a U.S.-born child of Chinese immigrants who had experienced war and occupation, but never with the luxury of reflecting on it politically. This credo comes from one of critical race theory's women warriors, Mari Matsuda: "We will not be used." I had just graduated from undergrad here at UCLA in 1993 and also was able to take a small part in the campus-wide movement at the time for our Chicano Studies department. Through hunger, fasting, and solidarity work across all the communities of color who were galvanized to act in solidarity. After graduation, I continued to work with undergrads in Asian American Studies through a three-campus leadership and activism development project, and we used Mari Matsuda's article as a foundation, along with Martin Luther King Jr.'s Beyond Vietnam speech. I am mentioning this period in 1993 because I was being introduced to critical race theory, and I had no clue at the time. All I did know then is that this short phrase, "we will not be used," captured and continued to capture my political imagination and fortitude. All I know now, 20 years later, is that without it serving as my personal political compass, the imagination that has taken to birth and sustain CADRE as an organization would never have been inspired. And it's in this context that I hope my remarks serve to cause and provoke really thoughtful reflection about how we take this work out into the streets. So because of what this short and sweet manifesto conveyed to me then and now, all of the political creativity that has inspired, this careful, calculated, yet boundless cha-cha dance step of on the one hand, unforgiving attention paid to the multi-century consequences of racism being maintained as a structure to manifest economic domination by a few, and on the other, countering this cold reality with the warmth of belief in our human ability to co-create a new existence via liberation and participation-driven community organizing. This, what it really has conveyed to me is faith. Faith in the imperative and act of choosing a side. We are either undermining structural racism or we are not, and there is no middle. I can only talk about CADRE and the work we do as an embodiment of choosing sides. And we also would not have come as far were it not for a handful of lawyers who chose our parent side, the young person side, and the community side. Here's what I mean about choosing sides. I either chose these sides personally, leading to the vision for CADRE, or we created conditions for our parent member leaders to choose these sides as we built CADRE. So many of you may know and can read my bio for the work and some of the policy victories you've had, but I'm going to take you down a journey of our choices. So, and for the sake of exercise, I invite you to imagine what your choices would be as well for each of these points. So we chose to do education reform in South LA versus somewhere else. Research has shown that reform is much easier when schools are more homogeneous, stable, much more difficult when there is racial, cultural, linguistic tension and competition within the school communities. We chose South LA anyway. Working with and seeing men affiliated with gangs, quote unquote, as the most legitimate peace builders, believing that those viewed as perpetrators with a certain set of conditions can choose to transform into the greatest community assets. Organizing both black and brown parents in ever-changing South LA, ignoring demographics and viewing both sets of interests equally. Choosing an analysis that the fundamental reason for the failure of public education is disdain for blackness, however associated and identified, and poverty, almost one and the same. Organizing parents of color versus organizing young people. Knowing the viciousness of disdain for adults of color in poverty and their quote-unquote lost cause status. Again, would you choose to work with adults or young people? And we have chosen to work with adults. We've chosen to constantly measure our success in building a parent membership and leadership base by the number and quality of our involvement of black parents and caregivers. So in all cases, we look at how well or if we are involving black parents in our work, regardless of the demographics of the schools or the neighborhoods that we're in. It could be 90% Latino, but we are still aiming for a 50-50 membership. Identifying treatment, aka dignity and respect, and inclusion/exclusion in participation as an organizing issue. Back in 2002, this wasn't so popular. You were supposed to go for bread and butter resources, money, books, bathrooms, teachers, credentials, etc. And we went for treatment. We wanted to make the systematic mistreatment the actual structural issue. And it has become our systemic change goal. Another choice, formulating standards, quote unquote, of treatment as campaign demands rather than resources, and articulating power shift as the ultimate desired outcomes rather than educational resources, programs, or services. We chose to pursue this power shift through the calculated risk nearly 10 years ago of organizing parents to end school push-out and the school-to-prison pipeline, meaning parents challenging both policies and practices, focusing on the bottom falling out versus the glass ceiling to college access and completion. We kind of left that to others, and we chose to focus on the bottom falling out, knowing ultimately that the convergence would happen. Choosing this issue along with the treatment of parents so that we would address the egregiousness of dehumanization and exclusion of black students and the black community in public education, and that the treatment of parents and parents fighting for their children being one of the most dehumanizing and heartbreaking exhibitions of that. Taking the long road to decreasing dropout by challenging schools to keep in school their least wanted students versus working with those most self-motivated and supported. Which one would you choose? Developing a theory of change at South LA parents of color and poverty, challenging, interrupting, stopping, and persistently monitoring exclusionary school discipline practices is the key to making public education viable in South LA versus focusing on college. Adopting a human rights framework in order to challenge the limitations of precedents in civil rights frameworks and ensure that we could talk about racial discrimination without having to prove intent. We chose to center our work around three key human rights: the human rights to dignity, quality education, and participation. We name the insufficiencies, inequities, and injustices in education as human rights violations rather than civil rights issues. We chose a long-term campaign, now in its nearly 8th year, and call it our Right to Education campaign versus an outcome, aka campaign to get X, campaign to win Y. And our policy victories are seen as merely a means to an end rather than ends in and of themselves. We chose to use community organizing to change school practices first and resources second. Because without a new framework, new resources are not going to do much good. We built a national coalition, as Professor Nanda mentioned, with this human rights framework and called it the Dignity in Schools campaign, and fought and have continued to fight so that most affected communities are at the center. Power shifting from attorney advocates to base-building community organizing groups and collecting solutions into a model school code that blueprints fulfillment of human rights in our public schools. So working on the solution as well as strong analysis of the problem. We have chosen to train parents to monitor schools' implementation of district mandates to end or reduce school suspensions, which we helped bring about. We've trained them to monitor racial and gender disproportionality in school discipline, collecting our own anecdotal data, doing our own independent data analysis, and using it to challenge institutional assertions about whether or not they're really implementing their policies. We have chosen to challenge attorney advocate partners to share power, information, access, and process with grassroots partners/clients, shifting power dynamics within a broad-based coalition, calling out race and class-based exclusionary practices even among our allies. Internally at CADRE, we hold ourselves accountable to the decisions made by our parent leaders, knowing full well that that is a sharing of power. We practice transparency as an emerging principle in undermining racial hierarchies, that in order to truly begin to do so, we have to be transparent. We resist the tendency to criminalize behaviors conditioned by poverty. We resist competition, the quote-unquote good versus bad parent or student or community, viewing meritocracy as an engine of structural racism and denial of humanity. Resisting the temptation of new governance and management models, such as charter schools, for schools as quick-fix civil rights solutions. As far as we're concerned, we all have yet to figure out how to humanistically educate our black children. Until then, all of us are held back and held under a false belief in better than as a way of valuing ourselves. And lastly, we've chosen to tamp blind loyalty to teachers' unions and measure our solidarity based on the balance of their commitment to unionism, as well as eliminating racially disparate educational outcomes, which require giving up some power fundamentally. So choosing these sides has been the secret to CADRE. In other words, choosing to confront race has been our secret. As a result of all these choices, CADRE picked up again the battle to end racial disproportionality in school discipline. And while we have a long way to go, we always. We have been able to utilize the power of marginalized parents' voices to both usher in new district-wide policy in the Los Angeles Unified School District and to elevate a movement led by grassroots communities across the country and now across California. While the crisis of push-out and the school-to-prison pipeline is far from new, and while CADRE is certainly not the first group to organize parents around it, the fundamental questions of what it would mean to keep all students in school, every last one of them, to reject the criminalization of children of color's behavior is now being debated in the public sphere, in Congress, and we're able to counter efforts to arm school personnel, put more police in schools, and turn more schools even more so into the prisons that most of them already are. For whatever part we have played in catalyzing this shift that's allowed us to put up this resistance, CADRE is extremely proud because we did it by deliberate attention to race. And of course, the story isn't only about race. It is about power as people of color, and not the often used term of speaking truth to power, not just that, but the power to challenge all of the other oppressions because the racial analysis is grounded in truth. At CADRE, we value truth-telling above all else, and that includes honoring the fact that because of structural racism, organizing communities of color in South LA across racial lines means accepting that the standard is not political correctness, that is not how people will always line up. but that have experiences and have had very little access to consider the root causes of these experiences. And therefore, the experience is the truth that we, as organizers, commit to struggle by any means necessary to accept unconditionally. And from there, we figure out how complicated the intersections of race, gender, economic access, system involvement, language, and undocumentation really, really are. I dare say that to use critical race analysis and community organizing to redefine public education, it is all about self-reflection as to whether or not we're being used. Whether our college degree status is causing us to want to reform not education, but really the people who are poor. Whether our own notions of good and bad students, good and bad parenting, and parents are upholding the very paradigm that has made educational outcomes racially unequal and inequitable. Education and the merit we derive from attaining it is such a lure to forget. To forget that in order to have succeeded, there needed to be many others who had to be considered failures first. The behaviors that are key to such success, when we have the privilege to learn and practice them, also justify the exclusion of those who do not exhibit those behaviors, who never have the context to deconstruct what would be necessary and worth compromising for one's economic advancement. When I tell people that CADRE organizes parents, or that our parents are organizing to change school discipline in the school-to-prison pipeline, one of several things tends to happen. The assumption is made that we're teaching parents to be good parents first, or an assumption that our parents are trying to get other parents to be good parents, like them, so that their children do not misbehave in schools. Or that ending the school-to-prison pipeline, quote-unquote, is about parents supporting tough scare tactics to keep their kids out of prison. And so I take a deep breath and decide whether or not to have this conversation, knowing that it will challenge their fundamental beliefs. I usually smile too, but it's hard, pretty much impossible to avoid a perception that I'm either apologizing or making excuses for the quote-unquote bad behavior of poor folks of color, or somehow I'm not holding them responsible, or blaming teachers, or trying to lay a guilt trip, plain and simple. And to most folks, I probably am doing all those things, but I offer a reframing of all of it. I feel that in doing so, we are recognizing the behavior of survival from unwantedness, from being devalued. We're holding the system of structural racism more responsible for our educational failures rather than individual responses to the system, as if all the data means that every soul behind each number, every dropout, every bad statistic somehow implies that there's a human soul behind that number that just doesn't care about education, doesn't want to strive, doesn't want to be human. It's just impossible to believe. And I do believe that all people of privilege inside a school, including teachers, and while we must stand by them, they bear a responsibility to not further oppression. And while guilt is highly unproductive, we should never consider comfortability with the status quo a measure of success. Organizing to repurpose our public education system is organizing to end structural racism and all the values that uphold it and produce it through our current system. It is about cross-class solidarity. It is about recognizing the most egregious ways in which all oppressions converge in the institution in which we have placed our deepest hopes and aspirations, to which we entrust our blood and turn a blind eye in the hopes that ours make it. And it is about not being used. Short and sweet. Thanks, as always, for listening. Much love and respect for our shared struggles and pursuits of justice, and I hope I provoke some thoughts so we can have some Q&A. Lunch, so you're tired. I hope I didn't talk too long. Are there any questions or comments that folks want to ask about our work or any of the ideas that I put forth in the last few minutes? Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
First off, I want to say thank you.
You're welcome.
Very wow. But my question concerning is, what other models of other organizations that you taking any knowledge from to help you consolidate all these great thoughts and ways of approaching these problems for me, I didn't even think of approaching them in that manner. So.
I'm not saying there aren't models, but I will say that I don't think we sought first to look for them, you know. I think we sought first to, I mean, I personally, originally the vision was actually much more modest than what it has become. The vision was just to ensure that parents from South LA could, you know, had places at tables around decisions that would, you know, places and respect and access that would allow them to communicate the strengths of their children, their families, the community, etc., and to force those decisions to build on those strengths rather than to be deficit-oriented. Over time, once I started talking about all of this and building a parent organization with the South LA parent that co-founded CADRE with me, may she rest in peace, she really turned it in. She actually saw a movement of parents. And you know, from that moment on, I think everything was crystallized differently. And I'm not saying we didn't look. I've certainly myself and she herself, as a very involved parent for 10 years, had a lot of influences. But the one thing across all of them that was left unanswered was that no one was really trying to build the power of parents. No one was addressing race. And to her, her children dropping out or the schools not understanding them and dismissing them was a matter of life and death. That disengagement causes a life of disengagement that then can really bring about your own demise. And so for her, parent involvement was not a competition, was not a star on her chest, was not good parenting. You know, it was what she was supposed to do to keep her kids alive. And so from that paradigm, you know, again, I think, you know, in perfect honesty, it wasn't that we didn't have other models, like I said. I think there were a lot of great processes, techniques, what have you. But I think what was different is it wasn't always encompassed by a true renegade vision of tackling race, you know, and looking at the fact that low-income parents of color cannot challenge schools. They cannot. It's almost illegal. They will call the police on you. Unless now you sign a charter petition. So it's very, very, there are many trade-offs to actually speaking truth to power, and there actually needs to be infrastructure, political leadership that has to be developed within the community so that, you know, whatever speaking of truth is done is not appropriated and misused to actually implement forms of education that still don't address, you know, our entire nation and quite frankly our global denial of rights to people of color and especially black folks. So I hope that answered your question. Okay, I don't know who was first, so I'm going to swap sides to kind of mix it up. So we'll go over here. Yes.
I'm curious. It's very clear that you're really intentional. You and your organization are really intentional about applying regional analysis within the work that you do and incorporating it. And I'm curious about how that plays out within the context of being, are you 501c3 or 4? Or
We are the former, the 501c3.
Okay, so within the context of being a 501c3, which is often very restricted by sort of this dominant colorblind paradigm, particularly, my question is about funding. You said that you had just recently secured $1 million.
That's over time, actually. Very small budgets year to year, though.
The intentionality that
Yeah.
is or is not involved in how you deal with sort of the more dominant nonprofit 501c3 structure and how you navigate that.
It's a really great question. So some people know the story, not everybody does, but you know, every about 5 years or so, parents are in. Okay, you can count. Trust me, 5 years from now, they will be in again, and they'll fall out, and they'll be in again. So every 5 years or so, you know, you kind of get some play when you organize parents. It's like you try, people don't necessarily get to scale, don't succeed, you kind of lose focus, everyone gets gaga. I mean, no disrespect, but, you know, people much more heartwarmed by organizing young people. And so that flavor is always there, but the parent flavor goes in and out, the style, and then when people realize, you know what, we need to organize parents, and oh my God, and then suddenly, you know, whichever group kind of comes next as organizing parents kind of gets that new label. So when we started, we had 3 very small grants that maybe added up to $50,000, which allowed us to start opening the office and hire some staff. And guess what? And I was naive enough to think that money would keep coming, and it stopped. And so I laid myself off for about 2 years, paid the organizing staff first, which went against the grain because most people are like, you pay the director first, right? I was like, no, because if they're not knocking on doors, I really have no reason to do anything. So some of you might have seen me at Trader Joe's on 3rd and La Brea, because that's where I was, 20 hours a week. I did consulting. I did all kinds of odd things to make room for that to be the main thing that we did. Because I also wasn't, we actually were fiscally sponsored for the first 10 years, and we weren't trying to be an organization to be an organization for just because. And so we knew, and I knew, that if it didn't pan out, we would just pack up and go home, and that the fundamental reason of existing was to do the thing we were going to do, not to be a 501c3. So to answer your question, it was very difficult in the first few years to get money because we didn't do the typical things that I mentioned and alluded to. We did the things that we did, and we took 3 years to figure it out. But when we figured out, it was this amorphous thing called treatment. I know someone literally looked at me sideways like, treatment? Yeah, the treatment of parents of color is the issue for parents. They can't do anything. There are parents' rights, but there are no conditions to practice those, in which they can practice those rights. And so it was kind of like a sideways look, okay. And, we were pretty not resourced for a while and managed to eke it out. But I think that experience, that choice, as I keep alluding to, paid off because we became who we needed to become. And before we really got any major funding, we had made key decisions that probably would have caused us to fall for the okie doke anytime some money came around. So, for instance, we chose to be about systemic change, whereas most people organize parents to put out a fire, to react to something, to get something, and then it's over. And there's no attention paid to their humanity and their political development. We chose the systemic change we wanted to end school push-out and end the school prison pipeline. As I mentioned, that was not popular back in 2004. And Saul knows this. It was more trendy to do college access. Because the middle class aspires to middle class values. Who can argue with that, right? And you kind of don't worry about the other kids who don't seemingly want to go to college. And you work on that middle that wants to go. But we chose this de facto system that our parents defined as what the real system is. And then lastly, we called it push-out rather than dropout. And it was a little controversial then because it accused the school too much of something intentional. And we define it as both egregious push-out through school discipline and dehumanizing practices, but also the conditions that just make it much easier, much more incentivized to leave rather than stay. So it's a whole set of things. And those 3 decisions were seminal in who we have become. And I, as an organizer, I'm just grateful I'm a good listener. I listened and we didn't move too fast and we allowed these decisions to surface. And then about a year later, we decided to adopt the human rights framework because we knew that, and direct experience proved, that education is not guaranteed at all. Even though it's technically in the Constitution of our state, it can be taken away. And so it was devastating to our parents, and we needed something else to hold on to that would speak to, this right, this human right. So now, we're the flavor of the month because of what we do. As everyone has noticed, there's an upsurge in work around school to prison pipeline everywhere you look. And so as one of those folks, groups rather, that has been doing it for a while and is still doing it and has done it so thoroughly and deeply that, we are like almost experts in not just the dismantling of the practices, but the monitoring of them, how to use a grassroots community organizing model to monitor these issues on campuses. We have suddenly grown, threefold in the last 3 years. It's not easy to do that. Mind you, if anyone has run a nonprofit, that is a huge pace to keep up with, and it's not easy. So there's a blessing and a curse all at once. And I would say that, the quote-unquote nonprofit industrial complex is real. You cannot do just what you want. And the only secret now, I think, to staying afloat and not compromising and being able to sleep at night, quite frankly, is what I just talked about, is really having a genuine analysis that's grounded and not fly-by-night, not on the tails of something. And then to know that unless you can, reframe and negotiate a frame so that it continues to support your values and principles, it's almost not worth it. So I hope that answers your question. So, and then, yes, back over here, and then back there and up front. Yes, you. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm saying you. I apologize for that.
So I love what you were saying about reframing in a way that empowers parents, and I think one of the key ideas that I heard you mention that I hope you say more about is talking about the analysis on what constitutes good students and good parents. Can you say a little bit more about that? Because I think
Sure.
that is the pivot around which you can leverage a lot of powers for parents.
Right, so we don't talk about it. We kind of say that, from a human rights standpoint, there is no value judgment there, if you think about it. And I know that in the legal community, human rights, there's a love dismissal, whatever you want to call it, of human rights, because it doesn't have a lot of precedents that you can hang your hats on, and it's very difficult. But I can say with direct experience as an organizer, human rights is like a freeway to a consciousness about, not just injustice, but intersectionality, obviously, and the humanity, the human costs of not having these rights fulfilled. And so we've never really talked about good versus bad, and that's why I spoke about it, because we're kind of trying to reject it. In large part, and not because we don't, as human beings, actually have a good and bad trigger. We all do, right? It's ingrained in us, and we all have our judgments. But it's just recognizing that's a continual process to undermine that, to dislodge it from as our only context for understanding what it takes to succeed and what is somehow detrimental. And in our work of trying to fight for the kids that nobody wants, we are, in essence, saying that they're human beings, period, first and foremost, and the application of justice and the application of rights should not be denied to them. So good and bad kind of comes more from our subjectivity, but not from our framework, if that makes any sense. It's still part of our human condition, right? We all have that. And we all have things we want and we don't want for our families and for ourselves. And so it's not... it's sometimes unrealistic to think you can purge yourself of that, dialectic of good versus bad. But it's the fact that we don't organize around that. We're not trying to promote good, one good versus another good, or one good instead of bad. And so, for instance, the issue of, as everyone has probably noticed, the issue of willful defiance is a huge issue now, policy-wise, because 40%, almost 50% of school suspensions are for willful defiance. So any one of you that just raised your hand right now, if I didn't call on you and you just spoke out anyway, that's defiant. And people are getting suspended from school for that. And that's where is my proof that it is about a disdain for people or behaviors associated with the people that cause that to be utilized in such a way. Because it's where 75% of the African American student suspensions are for. That's what they are for, is for willful defiance. And so that's why if we're going to challenge that, then we have to challenge this quote-unquote good versus bad paradigm. Because in another context, speaking out is a good thing, right? So there's no other reason that that could be a bad thing and a punishable thing if it weren't because of structural racism. So you have to challenge good versus bad, otherwise you support that. And in our work, we can't afford to support that. So we just don't I wouldn't say that we're outright saying we don't support it. I think most parents come with good and bad. They have a lineup of what is good and what is bad. And so we're not trying to force parents to drop all that right away. We're trying to support a political evolution that understands how that hurts us, and how that paradigm denies things to people, including ourselves and our families, and how it is also the value that upholds the very system that is excluding us. So I hope that wasn't too convoluted there, and I hope I answered that question. So I think on the back there was a hand. Yes, yes, it is you. So
as you know, the right wing has been attacking the public education system for decades.
right.
Using the dysfunction of schools and of teachers as an excuse to defund schools and also to defund their entire security programs. So
So that question is interesting because sometimes the right is actually not our biggest enemy. Believe it or not, it is actually liberal thinking, quite frankly. And I'm sure as critical race theorists, you all know what I'm talking about. So, you know, the thinking that we just, and we have to, you know, we can't dismantle it. It's not like we don't want more resources, or that we don't want funding, or we don't want to support efforts that preserve funding. But we just know, our parents have always said that money is not the issue. However, probably what's worse about the right wing is the pure, straight-out racism that is actually being conveyed, and the actual dehumanization and you know, kind of demonizing of people of color. But again, I don't think most people, if you're a real organizer and you're really in the streets, I don't think that's new either. So, you know, a lot of it is keeping perspective. If you really have your ear on the ground, a lot of this is not as dramatic as, you know, it looks. It's just unfathomable that we can have it in our public discourse, you know, by educated, professionally paid people spouting it. But I think on a real day-to-day level, if you look, and I'm sure all of you know, if you look at the way folks are treated inside any form of detention and lockup, if you look at the way that you know, I just came from a meeting. We still sometimes have to go with parents to these meetings where their kids are being, like, intervened upon, and it's not a good dynamic. And it's the first opening line. There's 3 teachers. There's one parent who's very involved, trying to do everything she can to bring her son's grades up, in the Valley, no less. The first opening salvo is, your child is failing my class, and then a litany of behaviors that are undesirable, and then another teacher saying, you know, I looked up your address and you're not even supposed to be here. So that's the opening line of a parent meeting. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think any of us would stand for that, but somehow a parent of color is supposed to stand for that. So in dialectic with what you just said, you know, and these are people who have chosen the, you know, profession of teaching, who probably are on the one hand more altruistic than most people, but that good and bad paradigm reigns so supreme that that's how people are dealing with one another, through this lens of, you know, meritocracy and competition, and valuing people as if somehow, you know, we are supposed to play that role. So in many ways, you know, I think the grounding of what we react to, as I said in my remarks, you know, our race analysis, you know, it's not like we've had our parents read every article there is on structural racism. I wish we had the time, but we don't. And so a lot of it is unpacking their real experiences. And again, as I said, not expecting political correctness or civil rights analysis or this, that, and the other, but actually allowing the experience to represent our struggle, you know, of how do you use that as a source of real power building. And so a lot of this work, a lot of the nuances that you've heard is really coming about because of listening. And I mean, I can say unabashedly myself, and I'm pretty sure most of our, you know, our staff as well and our board members, is that we have an unwavering attention to race. And as far as the 501c3 world, that's also not highly welcome either. So again, it's a choice. You choose a side. You can't really waffle in the middle, because if you do, you're really kind of not doing much. So I hope that answered. And then there's yes, and then I'll get to you.
That changed from the time based on what you were saying. It's really, you know, just admirable, kind of what you do, because it's God's work in a lot of ways.
Thank you.
And my first thought was about the criminalization of the children, especially with this truancy nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I wondered if you guys work with that.
We do.
You're talking about the willful defiance. So with those two together, it's like, you know, you're going to have black kids that are going to be going to jail before they get to high school.
Right.
So could you just talk more about the work that you do?
Sure. Well, we that's not our main issue campaign, but we work very closely with other organizations for whom it is. And so we work in in Dignity in Schools campaign. We have a LA chapter, and the Labor Community Strategy Center and Youth Justice Coalition are very close allies of ours, and we support their efforts And we collectively were able to renegotiate a new directive, I guess, coming out of the LA School Police Department, which is the largest in the country, of how they will now not ticket, people on their way to school. But that conversation, and in the aftermath of Sandy Hook, has obviously been, gone from one extreme to the other. But as I said in our remarks, I think we have built such a rigor of our analysis about this work with all of our allies about criminalization and around school push-out and the school-to-prison pipeline that we actually have some resistance to it. Now, with that being said, policy-wise, we have a resistance. I think you can put a moratorium on tickets as another victory with the LA City Council cause. You can't do it till your third truancy, supposedly, your third citation. You can do that. You can stop suspending students. We have helped pass school-wide positive behavior support as the framework for school discipline at LA Unified, and with that, they were monitored by the Office of Civil Rights from the U.S. Department of Education and had to agree to reduce their racial disproportionality in their African-American student suspensions. So that all came out to be stop suspending kids. It was the mandate internally within the district. But guess what? As we all know, there are workarounds to that. You just find other ways of excluding people, illegally, informally, or you treat them worse, as well, because you can't suspend them. And we're not saying teachers should just deal with whatever, and we do have empathy for teachers who have no support and do not know any alternatives and don't have the time or resources and support to learn alternative practices. So that's our next struggle, is to support the transformation of practice. But I think the main thing I want to say in response to your question is that we look at every data piece and data set through the lens of whether or not it's impacting black children. So for instance, Los Angeles Unified, when we started in 2005, had 73,000 suspensions that year. 90% of them were black and brown kids. Probably a quarter of them were, or more, almost 30% of them were for African American students when they were only 9%. So it's like 3 times their enrollment. And so now, years later, with all these mandates and all this scrutiny, it's gone down by a lot. I mean, like, a lot. On the books, anyways, right? It's maybe down, I can't remember what the last number is, but it's gone down by over 50%. But the suspension rates of African American students has gone up. It's still up. It still goes up. So it is a relentless pursuit of the race question. It affects, obviously, girls and boys. There's been a lot of focus on black boys, but, we all know that black girls are not any different, really. They're suffering in many of the same ways. And so, that paradox is something that we have to force people to struggle with, because on the face, everyone wants to shout victory and change. And so it's my assertion that it's what I said earlier, that it's really disdain for behavior. So how can we have equity in this country if there's like a list of behaviors very explicitly that are being excluded, that are being reacted to, that are being punished, and that every form of law and educational administration is being applied to it so that it can't be challenged, until it's too late. So that's what we are facing in education, and that's why this issue was such a political risk, because it meant that we would keep going down this path of asking these questions instead of being happy ever, because we're never going to probably be happy. And it's a lot easier to mobilize and galvanize people around aspiration, of going to college, of wanting to have a better life than your parents, etc. I don't knock all of that. I just think there's plenty of people to do that work, so we've chosen to do what we do, because that's a much easier sell. It's not easy. It's just an easier sell. I think I lost track. I see I see these 3 hands, but I had someone else prior to the 3 of you. Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah, I'll ask later. One-on-one.
Okay, great. Saul.
Thank you so much, Maisie. I'm working for taking our conversation where I think it really needs to go. My question has to do with a race question that's a little more personal. That has to do with how you think about your own role and decision. And I want to, as a point of entry, share something with you that a dean of this law school once said in the face of the kind of organizing that happens. He said, I don't understand why the Asian students come and complain to me about why there are no black students. Don't they understand?
Right.
You know, one more of them is one less of them. And so I offer that anecdote.
I'm glad you did.
I offer that anecdote to ask how you think about your personal decision as an Asian American woman to take on this work, and specifically black-focused educational reform, or whatever is the frame. And then broadly, how you think about the community of other Asian Americans. I think about Tammy Bandu, I think Key Study Center, Joanna Kim, I think Coalition Joshua Kim, goes out to Watts after Lawson. So how do you think about yourself and that community? That race question.
Well, I appreciate you asking me. I didn't want to spend all the time on me, but I did purposely choose Mari's credo, we will not be used, because it specifically guides me as an Asian American woman. Now, with that being said, granted that was in 1993 and things have evolved, but I don't think it's really changed. I think the imperative to not be used is for all of us, really, but in particular in my case. So there are many of us, first and foremost, and very few in education. And I think it's particularly poignant in education because of the stereotype that we live under as Asian Americans, because we are unwilling to give up our spot in educational progress to make more room for others. Like, it's just antithetical, and that's very much how I think most people are brought up, not just Asian American folks, but it's also endemic to who we are culturally. So, but I think the thing is about understanding how it plays out in the United States context. I think that sometimes the tensions reside because people think it's a cultural battle. Then it becomes a cultural superiority debate, right? Because of how it plays out here in this context, this competition, good versus bad, meritocracy that we assign to everybody, and we assign everyone's place and we assign everybody's role. So when I think of the few of us who are conscious politically and have devoted our souls to liberation, there are very few of us, and we don't get together that often, quite frankly, just so you know. We don't have a club, we don't have convenings. We probably should, but we don't, because I think we're holding it down and we're trying to evolve a consciousness, and I don't spend enough time with my Asian American brothers and sisters so that they can unpack what I'm doing. And that's part of the reason I was willing to speak today, because I need to learn how to, bring more people into this conversation. But the hard part is that we don't choose, and that's why I framed the speech today as choosing sides. So in particular, in my opinion, Asian Americans do not have a choice. You're either on the white supremacy side or you're on the side of liberation of people of color. But we try to occupy and straddle this middle. That is very confusing to us as well as to everybody else. So, and I mean, for instance, you can live in the community wherever you choose to live. It may be a white community because you want your kids to go to good schools, like many of our parents have done. Doesn't mean we're class equal. It just meant our parents want to live there no matter what. But by doing, we acculturate, we assimilate, we do different things, then we have to free ourselves from that and find our consciousness, etc. And so there's a sacrifice for all that success. And that sacrifice sometimes is we never recoup it, unless we become conscious somehow. And in many, many ways, I just don't think there's a middle for us to stand in. And so I often tell people who might have an inkling of understanding that what I do is my API consciousness in action. It is informed by an analysis of race, and it is definitely, just very practically speaking, where I feel like, my liberation is tied to the liberation of black folks, period. So, I don't talk about it because I don't think it's that special. It's kind of what I think we're supposed to be doing, but I guess it may be special to some people. I don't know. But we don't talk about it enough, Solo, quite frankly, and I do Tammy and our respective organizations do work together a lot, and we can count on one hand the number of organizing groups where we feel like we're really working for the least of us. We're really working to on the behalf of those who are unwanted, by this system. And so even then, there's even fewer of us who want to pick this difficult battle versus an easier one that kind of aspires to the common ground, that the narrative of American dream, and I think I've purposely chosen not to pursue that, not because I don't want good for people, but because I don't want to pay the price. I don't want our community to pay the price, even though it probably is being seen as not an ally on a daily basis. So, it's not a personal mission of mine to counter that, but I am trying to counter that because I can't do that by myself. What I really want to do is I want to show that, once CADRE does what I think it can do, then my attention will completely be about bringing API brothers and sisters into this mix. And I am speaking today also hoping and breaking down that API brothers and sisters will get into the mix and will choose to work in education and not just go work for a charter school and be among this cadre of Ivy League educated Teach for America folks. No disrespect if anybody is that. But I want to just say point blank, we are by identifying with that, we are wreaking havoc in the school system. And we have to, our community first has to take responsibility, and that's the first thing. If there's one mission I have, is that we take responsibility for our part in it. The last thing I will say to this is that I know that my parents worked around the clock, so they never went to one meeting. And I was never punished by some removal of my educational access because my parents couldn't make a meeting. So I dare say, and I hypothesize, that it's because somehow, the dominant culture wants us, sees a place for us, isn't threatened by us, and so none of that matters. But when you aren't wanted, then those behaviors are used to sort, exclude, diminish, devalue, what have you. And so I kind of feel like my own success is proof positive that it's about race. And I want, if anything, I want Asian American brothers and sisters to accept that fact and not be comfortable with it, and accept that that's our responsibility to bear, and our success has come at a price, a huge price. So, okay, I'm sorry, I had like 3 hands that I missed before out here. Yes, in front, and I will try to get to the other sides here. And are we out of time, by the way, or can? Okay, all right.
Just to shift gears a bit,
yes.
Can you talk about the role of any legal workers have had in CADRE or in the greater mission of your organization?
Great question. So I did mention that we've always worked with lawyers, right? And you're all not always that easy to work with. I'm sorry. And I'll say why. Not because the passion and the zeal is not there, or not because the convictions or the analysis and the consciousness is not there. But I guess somewhere along the way, this kind of going slower, planning, strategizing, it always seems to irritate attorneys. It's like someone told me, we learn how to put out fires. We learn how to react. We're trained to react. So the more strategic considerations of framing and messaging and strategic planning and 3 years down the line versus today and process kind of can become irritants, And so I would say that we have figured out finally, after about 8 years, how to set up a relationship working with attorneys where we're very upfront. And no, but it turns out great for the attorneys as well, because they don't have an experience like this anywhere else. So, and what I mean by that is that attorneys learning how to be accountable to community, and not clients, but community. Not clients, but a community endeavor that they are being brought into, right, as an ally, not helping out, not kind of in that way. So, attorneys at the very beginning help do Know Your Rights trainings around school discipline. But guess what? That turned out not to be enough, And then you have a lot of attorneys who I know are tired of just putting out fires and doing Know Your Rights workshops and want to be in on the proactive fight. And so because of our work and because of the traction it's gained and because of the networking among the attorneys that we have worked with, there is now, I think, a growing cadre, if you will, of attorneys who willingly, purposely work with community so that they learn a different way of working with community. So for instance, our monitoring of LA Unified's implementation of school-wide positive behavior support has been done hand in hand with attorneys at Public Counsel for the last 5 years. What that means is they plan with us, they wait until our parents make decisions, we write letters jointly, we always refer to the parents, we have meetings with our parents to figure out what goes in a public records request, and then when it comes back, they break down the data with their interns and clerks, but then they sit for hours with our parents and let our parents analyze that data with them. And then the recommendations that come out that are written up in fancy language it comes from our parents. You know, the essence of them comes from our parents. And we present a united front in all aspects. So anyone has a meeting with the superintendent, it's all of us together, right? It's never one of us. It's never one on behalf of the other. And that practice it takes practice. It takes a lot of practice, but over 5 years, I think, you know, I still can count on one hand how many, you know, attorneys just know how to do it kind of going in. But I think it's shifting. I think clerks are coming, you know, interns are being brought into the work earlier, fellows are being brought into the work. You know, a lot of the SCAD and Equal Works fellows are, is that the right term, Equal Works? Okay. And all these different fellowships, I think there's a new training ground that's happening. So, okay. Over here on the side. Oh, okay. Great. 2 for 1. And then I think I had one up here that I didn't get earlier. Are there any others? Yes.
Much earlier that went back to the initial question, and I think you sort of answered it, but you could really go kind of specifically into how you use your work in alignment with some of these other education advocacy organizations in LA at this moment, and specifically Parent Revolution that's doing parent organizing.
Yes.
With this approach towards
It's waiting for someone to bring them up.
and you know, really focused on kind of the here and now and problem
Yes.
solving and putting out fires.
Yeah.
How do you view kind of the work together, the parallels, the divergences?
I'll be honest, it's kind of incompatible. I just to be truthful. Not because we don't want some of the same things. I'm not saying that we don't. I'm not saying that collectively we haven't elevated the role of parents or that we haven't done some good on all fronts. You know what I mean? To force the issue, if you will, and to force there to be decision-making, legislated to be in the hands of parents. So those are always great things. I think the difference is that you just have to look at the source and the root of all things. And, you know, I don't choose to debate with the Parent Revolution ever, but people hear about them way more than they hear about CADRE. So as a result, I kind of have to distinguish, and I've been on panels with some of their staff. So we just don't talk about the same things. And what I mean by that is that I think race and oppression and parents being locked out and not getting what their, you know, the criminal kind of circumstances of our educational status today and the outcomes. I think we all frame and message that data in the same way, and we all share the outrage. But I think the difference is in getting there, as you would say, and it is more here and now. But as I mentioned in my remarks, governance is governance, right? And has yet to produce wholesale changes for an entire subgroup of people. That rarely are those solutions replicable, right? And the other thing that I think that on a human level that probably pains me the most about the kind of quick rapid fire parent organizing that $1 million will buy you is that, I mean, their entire budget is twice as big. They can throw $1 million into organizing a school for a turnaround to go charter, and you know, our budget is not nearly that high. It doubles up our budget. So the difference is that the experience of parents and there's no breakdown of power, and there's no breakdown of what education is supposed to be about. It's kind of always couched in terms of it fitting a suburban school, for instance, a middle-class school. You should have this too. You deserve this too. And I think it's very simple for people to understand. That's why everyone thinks they're doing a lot of great work. And I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying that, but if you're specifically trying to dismantle structural racism, that analysis and that solution is inadequate. And so it's kind of what I mean by we just don't really have the same conversation ultimately, like at some point, you know, and then it goes like this, right? And even though we work with the same constituency, you know, most of those organizations are backed by venture capital that has other political agendas that we do not have, point blank. So, you know, you have to know what's behind everything. Our parents ask a lot of questions. We're trying to build a place-based organization that has national impact. And by our attention to race, we're trying to, you know, create a model where at the neighborhood, grassroots level, we can challenge structural racism. And in so doing, we're shifting the power dynamics and modeling what parents of color can do anywhere, you know. And so we won't be a parent revolution. We will never compete with them. They may always get movies upon movies and, you know, all kinds of things, and we won't get that. But with all due respect, you know, I don't think we have the same agenda. So. Thank you very, very much. And I know I turned that into a talk show, but thank you, everybody.